Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the best recordings of Dvořák's Piano Concerto, an incredibly problematic work with a somewhat mysterious history that it's well worth explaining with the aid of a few musical examples, just to give you a sense of what's going on with this piece. This was the first of Dvořák's three major concertos, those for piano, violin, and then the famous late cello concerto. And it remains the least popular until recently because it seems to be making one heck of a comeback as, artists are looking for unknown works by major composers that are really great works. This is an incredibly fine work. It's had its champions. Brahms thought very highly of it. Not that anyone paid attention to that, and maybe that's a good thing, because who cares what Brahms thought about something? But seriously, this is the piece of music that really, I think, demonstrates, almost better than any other, that there is no substitute for actually listening. There are issues with the piano part. People say that there are issues with the piano part because Dvořák was not by nature a pianist. He was a string player. He was a violinist, later a violist. But that's not exactly true. He got his first job as an organist. He was a very good pianist. He wrote very effective piano parts for his chamber works. The piano part for this particular concerto is supposed to be singularly awkward for the pianist to play. But Dvořák certainly knew, and certainly could have known by looking at every other piano concerto in the universe that he knew well, which was like most of them, exactly how to write an effective piano part. So what was he doing here? Why did he make it difficult for the pianist? The piece is extremely hard to play, but not in a virtuoso sense. The difficulties have to do with the layout of the keyboard writing and the relationship between the piano and the orchestra. But again, Dvořák really knew what he was doing. It may interest you, for example, to know that this concerto has the smallest orchestra of any of Dvořák's concertos. In fact, it's nothing but double winds, two trumpets, two horns, timpani, and strings. It's exactly the same as Beethoven's Emperor Concerto, or some of the late Mozart concertos, maybe with the addition of one flute. It's a classical-sized orchestra, and this is a classically proportioned concerto. And the question really is not, does Dvořák's piano writing suit the virtuoso qualifications of a mid to late 19th century work, but rather, is the piano writing adequate for a classically proportioned concerto? And the answer unquestionably is yes. And if there are any difficulties in association with actually playing the piano part, it has to do with the fact that Dvořák wanted it to be somewhat of a challenge for the pianist, even though that challenge was one of musicality and one of balance and taste and musicianship and all those things, and not a question of virtuoso showmanship. And you cannot evaluate the effectiveness of this piece unless you play it. Unless you play it as Dvořák wrote it, with an orchestra, well played and well conducted. And quite frankly, the people who were judging this piece in the 19th century were not in a position to do that, because all they had was a piano part. And as pianists, they would look at it and say, oh, that doesn't look like Chopin. Or it doesn't look like X, Liszt. It doesn't look like someone. And if you were a composer like Brahms, whose piano writing is full of awkward bits and difficulties, even though he was a pianist, deliberately so, he could say, well, I intended that. I'm a pianist. I know what I'm doing. And people give him credit for it. They give him credit because he was, first of all, an intimidating German master, and because therefore, his awkwardnesses are never questions of competence. They're always by design. But we're not willing to give Dvořák the same credit. we're not willing to say that his awkwardness is something that arises from his intention and not from his lack of competence as a composer. Why? Because he was supposedly an innocent Czech peasant, a tunesmith who had no feeling for form, etc. I mean, the bullshit is endless when it comes to discussions of Dvořák and his reputation as a serious composer. Nobody wants to give him credit for knowing what he was doing. And although Brahms did, which is rather interesting. And in this particular concerto, I can play you some samples and we'll find out exactly what he was about. And what he was about is fascinating, absolutely fascinating, because one of Dvořák's main goals in life was to show that as a Czech composer, as someone who was really treated throughout his entire career as a second-class citizen in the German-speaking world, that he had as much right to participate in and interpret and challenge and question and query and celebrate the classical legacy of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, of the German masters, as anybody else. He was there to show that that was his legacy too, and nobody was going to tell him it wasn't. And this concerto is one of the main pieces in which he does that. He composed it around 1876. He revised it a couple of times himself for his own reasons along the way to publication in the 1880s. And as I said, it never became very popular in his lifetime. Pianists did not want to play it because it was awkward to play and because it wasn't an applause generator, which I don't understand at all because I think it's thrilling and gorgeous. And that's something that people recently have found out. And I just find it rather amazing. And so what happened, by the way, is that another Czech pianist / composer / pedagogue, Willem Kurtz, revised the piano part to make it more pianistic. And that's the version that everybody played until recently. And I am not going to talk about any recordings of those versions, even though there are some very good ones under, for example, Václav Tališ, with František Maxian or Ivan Moravec. He also did, only played the revised version. And even when the score was published in a theoretical critical edition, based on the composer's manuscript, here it is, see? There it says, based on the composer's manuscript. The piano part was published in two versions. There is, here's a typical page, as you can see. On the bottom of the page, see that there's a D and there's a K. And the D is what Dvořák wrote, and the K is what Kurtz wrote. And if you look at the beginning of the concerto here, like on page 15, you will see that in addition to twiddling the figuration to make the piano part fuller so that it theoretically stands out better against this teeny tiny orchestra. I mean, think of how stupid that remark is. Here you have an orchestra that's the size of Mozart and a piano that's basically a modern grand by 1876, and piano writing which is 20 times thicker than anything Mozart ever did. And you're worried about the piano standing out against the orchestra? It's Narishkeit, as we say in Yiddish. Foolishness, stupidity. But Kurtz did things like, I don't know if you can see this, but I'm going to see where my fingers are here, down here. If you look at this, did you see that? Is that there? Okay. If you can see that, what you'll see is that where Dvořák on the top wrote single notes with the melody, with the left-hand piano arpeggiating, Kurtz filled it out with chords. Big fat chords to make the piano part sound juicier, and that supposedly sounds more brilliant. Never mind the fact that the orchestra in this passage has nothing but pairs of clarinets and bassoons, pianissimo, and one note on the viola and one sustained note in the cellos. I mean, it's not even doing anything, so it doesn't make any difference. So much of this revision is completely pointless, but as I said, the only way you're going to be able to tell is if you can play the piece with an orchestra and see how effective Dvořák's actual part really is. And back in the day, without recordings, without radio, unless you had an orchestra and could actually perform it, you would never know. And so they didn't know. And based on the fact that they didn't know, they revised the piano part, hoping to make it more playable. And that, of course, didn't work terribly well either. It made it more playable for a couple of Czech pianists, and basically everyone else ignored it. There is a recording with like Bernstein and Justus Franz. They did it. A few people did it, but it was off the radar, unless you were a Czech pianist. And even then, most of the time you used the revised version. All of that changed when Richter, Sviatoslav Richter, did the original version with Carlos Kleiber on EMI. And that, of course, was a revelation, because even though that performance, quite frankly, is not one of the best, it's not bad. It's not bad. You know, you've got people who have such illustrious names. Everybody just goes, but it's a good performance, kind of muddily recorded. Kleiber, I think, is the one who's really off. Richter is fine, but Kleiber, I don't think, found the piece that interesting. It's okay. It sounds a lot better on CD than it did, but it was important because Richter played the original version. Now, Richter played the original version because if you saw all the documentaries and all the folder all about Richter, if there's a more awkward, more difficult version, that's the one he would pick, just to give himself something to torment himself with. And so the original version was performed. It sounded fine. It really does. I mean, you know, half the time at the velocity it's moving, you don't notice that there are chords instead of single notes, or the arpeggios go instead of, you know what I mean? I mean, how much difference is it going to make, right? So it's really not that terribly important unless you happen to be a pianist who are into these kinds of minutiae. And it was this Richter Kleiber recording that basically established the bona fides of the work as Dvořák wrote it. Since that time, all of the major recordings, and all the ones we're going to talk about, more or less use Dvořák's original versions. Some mix a little, some tinker, but pianists always do that. I mean, pianists tinkle. They do that too. But they tinker with Beethoven sonatas. They tinker with Mozart's piano writing. Pianists do that. Soloists do that. So I'm not going to worry too much about whether the version is Dvořák's original or original slightly amended or whatever, because it's not worth agonizing over. Dvořák's original is now the standard text. Thank God, for the most part. So what kind of a piece is it? What is it about this piece that freaked everybody out when Dvořák first wrote it? Well, Dvořák himself said that this was not a virtuoso concerto, that he was not the kind of guy to write a virtuoso concerto. That, if you think about it, is probably why the cello concerto is so successful, because it's an unusual concerto for an unusual instrument. And he had similar problems with his violin concerto for slightly different reasons, but the same kind of thing. People kept telling him what he should be doing, and he kept telling them to go screw themselves. And then when he didn't do what they told him to do, everybody just ignored it. That's what happens. That's what happens when you stand on principle, right? So here we have this concerto, and I'm going to play you the opening ritornello, or at least most of it. I mean, I don't have to play the whole thing, but it'll give you a sense. It sounds like a wonderful, soulful, Slavic, juicy, red-blooded, romantic piano concerto. And just listen to it for a bit. It's the first couple of minutes. This is the orchestral ritornello. So you know that because there's an orchestral ritornello and the piano doesn't come in right away, that this is a piece in classical concerto form, not the later romantic form pioneered by, for example, Mendelssohn, where the soloist comes in right away and plays continuously all the way through. So here we go. Have a listen. This is, by the way, the Naxos recording, which is quite fine, with Jano Jando, piano, and the Polish National Radio Symphony Orchestra under Antoni Witt. Beautiful performance. Here it is. I particularly enjoy, that first loud outburst when it starts going into triplets, da 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 da. It sounds so much like Brahms, doesn't it? And everyone says, Dvořák sounds like Brahms. He didn't know any Brahms when he wrote this. I mean, this was before he had a chance to hear Brahms's concertos, for example. He didn't know them at all. But Dvořák sounded like Brahms because they sounded like each other, not because one was copying the other. I think that's worth mentioning. We are always so quick to try and prove that someone copied from somebody and did something from somebody and with no evidence at all, just because they sound similar. Well, yes, they do sound similar. That's why they became friends, because they had similar aesthetic predilections, not because one needed to copy from the other. And although some of that sort of happened, and it happened in both directions, let us not forget. So that is the opening bit of the concerto, and it sounds nice and juicy and romantic and wonderful. Then the piano comes in and it plays, that stuff. But in this sort of sonata form, vaguely classical sonata form movement, we get to the second subject. And the second subject, I think, is fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. I'm going to play it for you. Take a listen. Now, who does that remind you of? It's not Brahms, it's Mozart, right? I mean, it's one of those da 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 dum bum 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 ba. I mean, it sounds like eine kleine Nachtmusik, right? That whole boom 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 da 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 dum bum ba dum. Right? I mean, it's Mozart. It's pure Mozart. But then it does a Czech thing. Da ba da bum 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 ba da. It goes back into your sort of Czech Slavonic dance, folky sort of thing, kind of, sort of. I don't know. But it's telling us. It's coming out and seizing us by the throat and saying, folks, this is my homage to the classical concerto tradition, to the tradition of Beethoven and Mozart, and I'm going to reinterpret it in my own way. And what Dvořák is telling us is that this is his program. And frankly, who the hell are we to tell him he can't do it? The only reason we should say he can't do it is if the result is horrible. But it's not horrible. It's gorgeous. It's totally successful. Now, the slow movement is one of those gorgeous lyrical things. I mean, Dvořák was an expert at those. No one has ever had a bad word to say about the slow movement. And the finale is delicious. The finale is full of humor and sexy melodies. I also will play you the opening of the finale because it begins with a fugato, like it wants to be polyphonic and serious. Then there's this big crescendo, and it turns into kind of like a mazurka, a sort of mazurka or a polonaise or something, one of those things. And here that is. absolutely charming, right? Full of fun and dance-like joie de vivre. But then it slows down for the second subject. There's this lyrical second subject that is in the yummiest sort of stranger in paradise exotic mode. And here's that, because this is also an important thing that I think has actually caused a lot of misunderstanding about what kind of a concerto this is. Beautiful, sweet, romantic, and it's very similar to, those gorgeous tunes in the finales of the Tchaikovsky first or the Rachmaninoff second concertos. It leads you to think that what we're talking about is a big virtuoso Slavic vehicle, not a classically proportioned, musically substantial, sophisticated approach to the classical concerto concept, albeit reimagined in Dvořák's own way. But that's the kind of concerto it is. And if you don't want to accept that, then don't listen to Dvořák's concerto. That's what it's doing. And I think that's just something that we have to learn and accept. And it's something that people in Dvořák's day were completely unable to see and unwilling to even imagine that this is what he could be doing. We don't want to give him the credit he deserves for being a master. It's that simple. All right, so let's talk about the other recordings, because I can just get all my backup with all of the foolishness that it seems to come with this piece and comes with the popular view of Dvořák as a composer, which just drives me nuts. All right, now, as I said, the recorded history of this work, as far as I'm concerned, begins with that Richter recording, which is a very good one, but not the best. And since then, there have been lots of them, really a lot of them, all with the original version, and most of them very good. And the interesting thing about it is that because this is almost a new work, and people are sort of discovering it, the people who have discovered it have done it justice. And there's very little difference in interpretation between various performances in terms of like tempi and shape and timing. It's a sign of how effective this piece is, that when you play it, you can only almost do it one way. The time, I was surprised going through these 10 recordings that I have. I actually have more than that, but we're talking about 10. How basically uniform they are in pacing. There's a lot of difference in piano playing and articulation and phrasing and all of those things, but the piece itself is 40 minutes long, give or take a couple minutes, and the first movement is 18 or 19 minutes, and the slow movement is like 9 or 10, and the finale is like 11. That's how it comes out, virtually every time. So there is Richter and Kleiber. Definitely worth considering if you're a Richter fan, but there are better versions of the orchestral part and better recordings generally. Now, there are a couple here that, unfortunately, I do not recommend. One of them is this one, this Paolo Giacobetti on Channel Classics, coupled with the Schumann Concerto, which we'll see again. Problem with this is not Giacometti. He's very, very good. He's a very good pianist. The problem is that the orchestra is not good. Not good at all. The Arnhem Philharmonic is just not a great orchestra. Under Michael Tilken, is that who this is? Yeah, someone like that. These are pieces both the Schumann and the Dvořák, where you need to have top-class orchestral playing, and nothing else will do. And here it doesn't. So there. Also, one not worth recommending is this one on Chandos with Rustem Hayrudinov piano. It's coupled with a fabulous violin concerto, unfortunately with James Ennis and the BBC Philharmonic under Gianandrea Noceda. I wish that the piano concerto were better. It's not terrible. It's a little bit mannered, a little bit on the less than, I would say, I don't know. It just seems to me, it's also a mixture of versions. He plays with the part a little bit much, to my way of thinking. Just doesn't hit me. You know what I mean? It's a pity, though. Great violin concerto. Now, here is an excellent version of the piano concerto. This is Stephen Hough on Hyperion, with Andres Nelsons and the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra, also coupled with the Schumann concerto. The Dvořák is a lot better than the Schumann. It's a great Dvořák concerto. And I think, again, it's because it was new and it was fresh, and Hough, who's written an article about it, it's in his book, Rough Ideas, whatever that book is called, of essays and things. It's about how, I think he felt it needed an extra effort on his part, which is great. Which is not to say that he didn't care about the Schumann, but the Schumann performance strikes me as a little bit mannered, a little bit less interesting, a little bit less well integrated between piano and orchestra. I think they really spent their time and effort working on the Dvořák here. It's a great Dvořák, though. It really is. Now, you've already seen me play excerpts from Yando and Anthony Witt on Naxos. Very well done, very inexpensive. Beautiful performance, nicely recorded. It comes with the Water Goblet, a good performance of that. And if you like what you heard, by all means, go for this. It's very, very good. Now, the next, what we have here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's one that I have in the overflow room that I don't have here. That's Andras Schiff and Dochnani. That is also a good performance, but I was not pleased with the sonics. It's a live recording with the Vienna Philharmonic. It struck me as somewhat hollow sounding. Although the performance is a good one, but I don't have it here, and I'm just mentioning it. I'm throwing it out there because if some of you may have it, it's coupled with, I think, Schumann's introduction in Allegro Appassionato. And it's not one of my top ones, even though it's quite respectable for what it is. These, however, five really first-rate performances that I'm going to mention. And again, this is not everyone. You may recall there was a super fun recording that had the Moravec's old version with the Dvořák original version, 2 performances of the work on one disc. There was that one. I'm not talking about that. And there have been a few others since. But these are the 5 that I really, really recommend. This is another Dvořák and Schumann, believe it or not. It's with Martin Helmchen and the Strasbourg Philharmonic under Mark Albrecht on pentatone, first class. A beautiful, beautiful performance, wonderfully recorded and shapely and attractive in every possible way. My sleeper choice, and this is just wonderful, absolutely blew me away. Vasily Primakov with the Odense Symphony Orchestra under Justin Brown on bridge. This came out of nowhere. It's absolutely first rate. A first-class performance, and it comes with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the Poetic Tone Pictures, a late Dvořák piano work which he never orchestrated, maybe he should have, which is really quite lovely. It's a major, major work. It's his major piano work of his last period. Unfortunately, there wasn't room for all of it because 5 of them alone are 28 minutes, and there are a dozen Poetic Tone Pictures. But the piano concerto, this is a great performance with a wonderful performance of the orchestral part from the Odense Symphony under Justin Brown. Definitely worth considering. First rate. Also first rate, Pierre-Laurent Aimard and Harnoncourt with the Concertgebouw. Yes, with the Concertgebouw Orchestra of Amsterdam. This is terrific. This is the kind of piece that needs a pianist who is a good chamber music player who has sensitivity to what the orchestra is doing and knows when to lay off and when to take center stage. And Amard and Harnoncourt are very, very good in that respect. And of course, with Harnoncourt as the conductor, you know that the orchestral part is going to be wonderfully characterized, and it's coupled with a knockout recording of the tone poem, The Golden Spinning Wheel, which, Harnoncourt's tone poems also were issued separately and all that. But if you don't have them, this is as good a golden spinning wheel as you're ever going to get. So this is a wonderful disc to consider. That's on Teldec. And then recently, just within the past couple of years, we got this fantastic disc from Suprafon. This is Ivo Kahanek. I just reviewed this on ClassicsToday.com. It's a 1010 of the Dvořák Piano Concerto with Martinu's fourth piano concerto, the Incantations, which is probably Martinu's greatest piano concerto. A totally original, fascinating work. And the two, as I say in that review, make very interesting and appropriate disc mates, because both of them are very difficult works, but they're not virtuosic works in the sense that they really depend on an integrated approach to the role of the soloist with the orchestra. And for that reason, they work well together. And because they're so different in style, they're well contrasted too. This is just a joy, this disc, from first note to last. Absolutely first class. And it's with the Bamberg Symphony under Jakob Hrusha. Yes, Hrusha, that's his name. Hrusha. Marvelous. Dvořák and Martinu piano concertos. However, if I had to pick one, and, I have to pick one, I'm going to stick with the last Firkušny with Neumann and the Czech Philharmonic. Now, I know that may be this is on RCA. It's now in the Firkušny box. You can still get it separately as a, like a print-to-order disc or something like that. It's available. Here's the deal. Firkušny recorded this work at least 3 times. There was one on Westminster, one on Vox. This is the only recording where he returns to Dvořák's original version. It is still, in some ways, the liveliest of them all, which is fascinating, given that Firkušny was at the end of his career. And it's just wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. And it's coupled with Janáček's Concertino and Capriccio, which are also wonderful. That's just a great bunch of couplings, a great disc all around, a wonderful tribute to a fantastic pianist. And it has to be my reference choice, even though I will listen to these others with joy, and I do listen to them as well. You got to go with Firkušny, or if you want to pronounce it that way. It doesn't make any difference. It's great either way. The Czech Phil and Neumann. Yes. So that, my friends, is the story, let me put this away, behind the Dvořák Piano Concerto, a piece that is coming out from the shadows that never deserved its unjust neglect. And as there are plenty of recordings out there that will allow you to savor it and experience it and enjoy it for the masterpiece that it really is. Something that we never would have found out unless we didn't keep on listening. Something you could not do in the 19th century, believe it or not. In some ways, we are luckier than they were, much luckier. So thank you, folks. Take care. Bye-bye.